What do you do when you are cursed to carry a plague in your soul that kills any alpha that claims you? And to alpha still decided to have you? Like and subscribe. The rabbit died quietly. Priscilla's hands, slick with blood and the fading warmth of the creature's life, worked with a grim efficiency that was at odds with their delicate appearance. Her pale blue eyes were narrowed in concentration, not remorse. Remorse was a luxury for those who weren't starving. One more day. This buys you one more day. Then you have to move again. She'd skinned the animal with a sharpened piece of flint, her movements practiced. The pelt, a pathetic, scrawny thing, would be useless against the true cold, but the meat was life. Her stomach clenched, a hollow, painful fist. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last of her stolen bread was a distant memory. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, so deep it was less a sound and more a vibration in the earth. It wasn't her stomach. Priscilla froze, the rabbit's heart slipping from her fingers to land with a soft thud in the leaf litter. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. Slowly, ever so slowly, she lifted her head. On the other side of her meager, smokeless fire, 2 wolves emerged from the treeline. They were massive shadows given flesh and fong. One was a dark, stormy gray, its eyes the color of a winter sky moments from unleashing a blizzard. The other was pure, liquid obsidian, its eyes a piercing, predatory silver. They were perfectly still, watching her with an intelligence that was utterly alien and terrifyingly familiar. Alphas. Her breath hitched, a sharp, painful sound in the silence. No. Not here. Not now. She'd been so careful, sticking to the blighted, unclaimed lands, the places no self-respecting pack would ever tread. The shattered territory was supposed to be a dead zone. Yet here they were. The gray one took a single step forward, its massive head lowered, nostrils flaring as it scented the air, scented her. The scent of frost-kissed pine and wild, storm-charged air washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. It was a scent that bypassed thought and spoke directly to the terrified wolf cowering inside her. Run, her mind screamed. But her body was locked, a statue carved from fear. The black wolf moved then, not towards her but in a slow, circling arc, flanking her, cutting off her retreat. Its silence was more menacing than any snarl. "Stay back," she whispered, the words a ragged plea. She fumbled for her flint knife, her blood-slick fingers struggling to find purchase. It was a toothpick against a tidal wave, and they all knew it. The gray wolf's form began to shimmer, to distort. Bones cracked and reshaped with a series of sickening wet pops. Fur receded into tanned skin, the massive body contorting, rising. In moments, a man stood where the wolf had been. Tall, broad-shouldered, and utterly naked. His hair was as black as his brother's pelt, his eyes the same stormy gray. A thin scar cut through his left eyebrow. Power radiated from him, a physical pressure in the air. His gaze, intense and unblinking, swept over her. The intricate white braids, the fair skin smudged with dirt and blood, the pale blue eyes wide with a fear she couldn't hide. He took in the skinned rabbit, the lack of supplies, the utter desperation of her camp. "Hunting is poor in the shattered lands," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Priscilla's grip tightened on the flint. She said nothing. Words were weapons she didn't know how to wield against such a creature. The black wolf shifted then, the process just as swift and brutal. The man who rose was his brother's mirror, yet fundamentally different. His eyes were a clear, piercing silver, his stillness more profound. He crossed his arms over his chest, the motion fluid and effortlessly commanding. A matching scar bisected his right eyebrow. "She's alone," the silver-eyed one stated, his voice smoother, quieter, but no less absolute. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her situation with chilling accuracy. "No pack. No fire. Living off raw rabbit." His eyes met hers. "You're not surviving. You're waiting to die." The truth of his words was a lance to her heart. She was waiting to die. Just not in the way he thought. She was waiting for her curse to claim her, or for someone to find her and finish the job Alistair's death had started. "What I'm doing is none of your concern," she forced out, her voice trembling. "Leave me." The first alpha, the one with the storm in his eyes, took another step. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could drown in the scent of him. "It became our concern the moment you crossed into our territory." "This is no one's territory," she argued, desperation clawing at her throat. It's cursed. Blighted. It's ours, the silver-eyed one said from behind her, his voice closer than she expected. She flinched, spinning to keep them both in her sight. They were surrounding her. And so, he continued, his silvery eyes holding hers, are you ours? The word was a cage slamming shut. Her wolf, the traitorous creature, didn't howl in protest. It stirred, uncurling from the deep, dark place she'd buried it, pressing against her skin with a desperate, aching curiosity. Recognized them. Wanted them. Well, they'll die. You'll kill them. Just like Alistair. You don't understand, she pleaded, her voice breaking. You have to go. Please. The storm-eyed alpha was right in front of her now. He ignored the flint knife she held out like a talisman. His gaze was fixed on her face, on the tears of sheer, helpless terror she couldn't hold back. Slowly he reached out. He didn't grab her. He didn't disarm her. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed against her cheek, smearing a track through the grime and blood. The touch was an electric shock. It wasn't violent. It was claiming. You're shaking, little prissy, he murmured, his voice dropping to an intimate, possessive rasp. And as the name, a name no one had ever called her, fell from his lips, Priscilla knew with a soul-deep certainty that her running was over. The real terror was just beginning. The touch burned. It wasn't the harsh burn of a brand, but something deeper, more insidious. It seeped through her skin into her blood, a warmth that spread through the frozen places inside her. Priscilla recoiled so violently she stumbled over a tree root, landing hard on the damp earth. The flint knife skittered from her grasp, lost in the leaves. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. You'll die. The words were a silent scream in her head, trapped behind the prison of her teeth. She scrambled backward, her palms scraping on rough bark and stone, putting precious, useless distance between herself and the naked alpha. His hand remained suspended in the air where her cheek had been, his stormy eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in a kind of intense, predatory curiosity. Easy, he rumbled, the word a low vibration in the ground beneath her. Easy. The laugh that tore from her throat was raw and broken. You shift out of nowhere, you corner me, you touch me. She wiped the back of her hand against her cheek, trying to scour away the lingering sensation of his skin on hers. It was futile. The scent of him, pine and cold, clean air and wild, dangerous power, was already in her lungs, a part of her now. Stay away. The silver-eyed brother, still standing with an infuriating, relaxed stillness, watched the exchange. Running seems to be your default state, he observed, his voice like polished stone. It won't work. Not with us. I'm not your anything, she snarled, pushing herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, threatening to buckle. I'm moon-cursed. Do you understand? My touch is death to alphas. Your bloodline ends with me. She hurled the words like weapons, hoping the fear they evoked in every other sane shifter would send them fleeing. But they didn't flinch. The storm-eyed one's lips actually curved into a faint, dangerous smile. Are you threatening us, little prissy? Don't call me that. The nickname, spoken in that rough, intimate baritone, felt like another kind of touch. It felt like he already owned a piece of her. My name is Kael, he said as if she hadn't spoken. He gestured with his chin to his brother. That's Rohan. Now you know our names. That makes us less of a threat, doesn't it? It makes you dead men, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, crushing dread. You just don't know it yet. Rohan, the silver-eyed one, finally moved. He walked over to her pathetic kill, crouching down to examine the half-skinned rabbit with a critical eye. You're doing it wrong. You'll tear the pelt. Waste the meat. He picked up the carcass with an efficient grip. A slow, stupid death from starvation or poisoning, or a quick one from a curse you may or may not carry. It's not much of a choice you're offering. It's the only one I have, she said, her voice hollow. Kael took another step, and this time she was backed against a thick pine, its bark digging into her spine. There was nowhere to go. He didn't touch her again, just leaned in, his face inches from hers, his scent overwhelming. Let me offer you a better one, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. Come with us. Eat a hot meal. Sleep somewhere that isn't the frozen ground. Her wolf, the traitor, surged forward at the words. Hot meal. Safe. Warm. It was a siren song to the cold, starving creature she had become. Her stomach chose that moment to cramp violently, a painful reminder of her emptiness. No, she breathed, but the refusal lacked conviction. Rohan stood, the rabbit in his hand. The alternative is we stay here with you. And the first rule of surviving the shattered lands, his cool silver gaze swept over their desolate surroundings, is that you never stay in one place for long. Especially not with the scent of fresh blood on the air. Other things hunt here besides us. The implication was clear. They weren't just the predators. They were also her only conceivable shield against whatever else lurked in this blighted forest. It was a cage, but it was a cage with walls that breathed and moved and promised, however falsely, protection. Kael's eyes held hers, the storm in them seeming to calm, leaving only a terrifying, focused intensity. We're not asking you to submit. We're not claiming you. Not yet. His lips quirked. We're just asking you to walk with us. One foot in front of the other. That's all. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. Every cell in her body screamed that this was the beginning of the end. But looking at Kael's unwavering gaze, feeling the implicit threat in Rohan's silent presence, and hearing the gnawing hunger in her own belly, the end suddenly didn't seem as immediate as the cold and the dark. Her shoulders slumped. The last of her resistance bled away, leaving her numb. If I come, you keep your distance. Kael's smile was a slow, triumphant thing. We'll keep all the distance you want, little prissy. He said the name again, and this time it felt less like a brand and more like a shackle being clicked into place. He turned, his naked back a landscape of powerful muscle, and started walking without a backward glance, utterly confident that she would follow. Rohan waited, his expression unreadable. He didn't gesture or speak. He just stood, a silent, immovable sentinel, until she pushed herself away from the tree and took the first stumbling step after his brother. As she fell into step behind Kael, with Rohan a menacing shadow at her rear, Priscilla knew with a sickening certainty that she had just traded one kind of death for another. And the most terrifying part was the tiny, desperate part of her soul that whispered it might just be worth it. They didn't lead her deeper into the blighted woods, but along its ragged edge. Kael, now clothed in dark, worn trousers and a fitted shirt he'd retrieved from a hidden pack, moved with a predator's silent grace ahead of her. Rohan was a constant, unnerving presence at her back, his silence more eloquent than any threat. This is a mistake. This is a trap. You're walking to your own execution. But her body, pushed beyond its limits, had overruled her mind. Each step was a fresh agony, her muscles screaming in protest after days of constant flight. The promise of a hot meal and a roof, any roof, was a lodestone she was too weak to resist. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, revealing a structure that made Priscilla's breath catch. It wasn't a cabin. It was a fortress, small but formidable, built of dark, weathered timber and river stone, nestled against a sheer rock face as if it had grown from the mountain itself. Smoke curled from a sturdy chimney, a promise of warmth that made her eyes sting. "This is the shattered lands," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "The very edge," Rohan said from behind her, his voice close enough to make her jump. "Our outpost. No one comes here. Except you," she thought bitterly. "You came for me." Kael pushed open a heavy, iron-banded door and stepped inside, holding it open for her. The wave of heat that washed over her was so intense it felt like a physical blow. After the relentless cold, it was a balm in a shock. She hesitated on the threshold, her instincts warring. "Come in or freeze, little prissy," Kael said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your choice." Swallowing hard, she crossed the threshold. The interior was a study in stark masculine efficiency. A large, central hearth blazed with a roaring fire, its light dancing over weapons mounted on the walls. Polished axes, wicked-looking knives, a massive bow. There were furs on the stone floor, a heavy wooden table and 2 large chairs. It was clean, orderly, and utterly devoid of softness. It was the den of 2 apex predators. And the scent. God's the scent. It was everywhere. The pine and storm smell of them was woven into the very fibers of the furs, soaked into the timber walls. It was a gilded cage, and the bars were made of their presence. "Sit," Rohan commanded softly, gesturing to one of the chairs by the fire. Priscilla remained standing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I'm fine. Kael let out a short, sharp laugh. You're about to fall over. He strode to a cupboard and pulled out a chunk of bread and a wedge of hard cheese. He tossed them onto the table. The thud they made was the loudest sound in the room. Eat. He stared at the food. Her mouth watered so violently it hurt. But to eat was to accept something. To be indebted. I'm not hungry, she lied, the words tasting like ash. Rohan moved to the hearth, lifting a pot that hung from a hook. He poured a generous portion of a thick, steaming stew into a wooden bowl. The rich, savory smell of meat and herbs filled the air, making her knees weak with want. He placed the bowl next to the bread and cheese. You're a terrible liar, he stated, his silver eyes pinning her. Your stomach has been growling since we found you. We've already gone to the trouble of finding you. Poisoning you would be counterproductive. Her resolve, brittle at best, shattered. With a shuddering breath, she stumbled to the table and sank into the chair. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely tear the bread. She took a small bite, then another, and then she was eating like a starved animal, shoving the stew into her mouth, barely chewing. The flavors exploded on her tongue: salt, fat, warmth. It was the most exquisite thing she had ever tasted. She was so consumed by her hunger that she didn't realize they had gone completely still. She looked up, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth, to find both of them watching her. Kael leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, a dark, unreadable emotion in his stormy eyes. Rohan stood by the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. They weren't watching with pity or disgust. They watched with a focused, unnerving intensity, as if her every movement was the most fascinating thing they had ever seen. As if she were a puzzle they were determined to solve. She slowly lowered the bread, her appetite suddenly gone, replaced by a fresh wave of fear. What? Nothing, Kael said, his voice a low rumble. Just looking. Why? The question was a plea. Because you're ours to look at, Rohan answered from across the room, his tone matter-of-fact as if stating the sky was blue. The words, so calmly delivered, stole the air from her lungs. She pushed the bowl away, the stew turning to lead in her stomach. I'm not. I told you. I'm cursed. The alpha who was chosen for me, he died. The moment our bonding magic touched. She waited for the fear, the dawning horror to appear in their eyes. It didn't. Kael pushed off the wall and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was looming over her, one hand planted on the table on either side of her bowl, caging her in. He leaned down, his face so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Let me tell you a story, little Prissy, he murmured, his breath a warm caress against her skin. Our pack has healers. The best. They say my brother and I carry a sickness in our blood. Curse if you like. They say that without the right anchor our wolves will turn on each other. That we'll go mad and tear our own pack apart. Priscilla's heart stuttered. She stared at him, her pale blue eyes wide. What does that have to do with me? A slow, predatory smile spread across Kael's face. It was not a nice smile. The moment we caught your scent on the wind, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, the screaming in our blood stopped. He straightened up, his gaze burning into hers, leaving her frozen in the chair, her food forgotten, her world tilting on its axis. So you see, he finished, turning away as if he hadn't just shattered her reality. Your curse and ours? We're a perfect match. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, pressing down on Priscilla until she felt she might break under its weight. Kael's words echoed in the hollows of her mind, a seismic shock that had left everything in ruins. The screaming in our blood stopped. It wasn't possible. It was a trick, a lie spun to lower her defenses. She was death to alphas. She was a blight, a walking plague. She was not a cure. You're lying, she whispered, her voice trembling. She pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping harshly against the stone floor. The movement was too sudden. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the rich stew threatening to make a reappearance. That's not how curses work. Mine kills. It doesn't fix things. Rohan turned from the hearth. The firelight carved the sharp planes of his face into angles of shadow and gold. His silver eyes, so much calmer than his brother's stormy gaze, held hers with an unnerving certainty. Is it so hard to believe that one broken thing might mend another? Yes. The word was a desperate gasp. Because I'm not broken, I'm lethal. Don't you understand? The moment you try to bond with me, your heart will stop. Just like his did. The image of Alistair's body, crumpled and lifeless on the ceremonial stones, flashed behind her eyes. She could still smell the incense, still feel the horrified silence of the pack. Kael had moved to lean against the mantelpiece, watching the exchange with a focused intensity. "Did you see it happen?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "What?" "The Alpha. What was he?" "Your betrothed." Kael's lip curled slightly on the word. "Did you see his heart stop? Did a healer declare it? Or did he just fall?" Priscilla's mind raced, scrambling through the fractured memories of that night. It had been chaos. The surge of bonding magic, a searing, painful connection that had felt all wrong, and then he was on the ground. The shouting had started immediately. Moon cursed. She killed him. "He fell," she said, her voice small. "There was so much noise. They dragged me away. I didn't see anything after that." Kael and Rohan exchanged a look. It was a swift, silent communication that spoke of a lifetime of understanding. It was a language she didn't speak, and its secrecy felt like a wall being erected in front of her. "Convenient," Rohan remarked, his voice dry as dust. A spark of anger flickered to life amidst her terror. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Kael said, pushing off the mantle and taking a step toward her, "that a dead alpha is a very useful thing for certain people. And a conveniently cursed Omega is the perfect scapegoat." The idea was so foreign, so monstrous that it stole her breath. She had lived with the weight of her guilt for so long, had worn her curse like a shroud. The possibility that it was a lie, a political murder pinned on her, was almost more terrifying. If she wasn't cursed, then what was she? Just a pawn? A victim? And if she wasn't cursed, then the terrifying magnetic pull she felt toward these two lethal males was real. And that was a danger far greater than any curse. "No," she shook her head, the white braids whipping against her cheeks. "You're trying to confuse me. To make me let my guard down." "Our blood is quiet for the first time in decades, little Prissy," Kael murmured, his voice a low, intimate thrum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He was close again, his scent wrapping around her, a heady mix of wilderness and safety that her traitorous wolf craved. "That isn't confusion. That's a fact." He reached out, slower this time, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His fingers didn't go for her cheek. They brushed against the back of her hand where it rested, clenched into a fist on the table. The contact was like a spark on dry tinder. A jolt of pure, undiluted energy shot up her arm, a current of warmth and rightness that made her gasp. It wasn't painful. It wasn't the searing, wrong-feeling magic of her attempted bond with Alistair. This was deep, primal. It felt like a lock clicking open in a door she didn't even know existed. Her wolf didn't just stir. It surged forward, pressing against her skin with a desperate, joyous whimper. Them. She snatched her hand back as if burned, cradling it against her chest. Her heart was hammering, a frantic, wild rhythm. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the confusing warmth. "Don't." Kael's eyes glowed with a fierce, possessive light. He had felt it too. She could see it in the triumphant set of his jaw. "You can lie to yourself, Prissy," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was for her alone. "But your wolf doesn't. And neither do we." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling and more terrified than ever. Because the greatest threat wasn't the curse she carried anymore. It was the devastating, terrifying hope that she didn't carry one at all. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the possessive crackle of the fire in the great hearth. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, a physical weight pressing down on Priscilla's shoulders until she felt her spine might bow under the strain. Kael's words echoed in the hollows of her mind, a seismic shock that had left every one of her certainties in ruins. The screaming in our blood stopped. It wasn't possible. It was a trick, a beautifully crafted lie spun from desperation or malice to lure her into complacency. She was death to alphas. She was a blight, a walking plague, a story told to frighten disobedient pups. She was not a cure. The very concept was so alien it felt like a betrayal of the very grief and fear that had kept her alive this long. "You're lying," she whispered, the words frayed and thin. She pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching a protest against the stone floor. The movement was too sudden. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the rich, unfamiliar stew churning in her hollow stomach. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles bleaching white. That's not how curses work. Mine kills. It rots and it ruins. It doesn't fix things. The last word was spat out, a bitter poison on her tongue. Rohan turned from the hearth, where he had been staring into the flames as if reading their fate in the embers. The firelight carved the sharp, elegant planes of his face into stark angles of shadow and molten gold. His silver eyes, so much more contained and analytical than his brother's tempestuous gaze, held hers with an unnerving absolute certainty. Is it so impossible to believe that one broken thing might mend another? That two wrongs in this singular, strange equation could somehow make a right? Yes. The word was a desperate, raw gasp. Because I'm not broken, I'm lethal. Can you not get that through your thick alpha skulls? The moment you try to bond with me, your heart will stop. It will cease beating in your chest, just like his did. The image of Alistair's body, crumpled and lifeless on the cold, ceremonial stones, flashed behind her eyes with the brutal clarity of a recurring nightmare. She could still smell the cloying incense, still feel the icy shock that had frozen her limbs, still hear the rising tide of horrified whispers that had crescendoed into a roar. Moon-cursed. He killed him. The Omega is a poison. Kael had moved to lean against the rough-hewn mantelpiece, watching the exchange with the focused intensity of a wolf observing its prey's final, frantic struggles. Did you see it happen? He asked, his tone deceptively casual, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his eyes. What? The question was so unexpected it momentarily derailed her panic. The Alpha. What was he to you exactly? Your betrothed? Your master. Kael's lip curled slightly on the words, a flicker of distaste that was there and gone in an instant. Did you actually see his heart stop? Did a pack healer declare the cause? Or did he just fall? Priscilla's mind raced, scrambling through the fractured, blood-soaked memories of that night. It had been a whirlwind of forced preparation, of being dressed in fine silks that felt like a shroud, of being pushed toward a man whose gaze had made her skin crawl. Then the ceremony itself, the surge of bonding magic, a searing, painful connection that had felt like a violation, a hook being set in her very soul, and then he was on the ground. The shouting had started immediately, a cacophony of accusation and fear. She hadn't seen anything after that, just a blur of angry faces and rough hands dragging her away, the word cursed chanted like a death knell. He fell, she said, her voice small and distant as if coming from someone else. There was so much noise. They dragged me away. I didn't see anything after that. I didn't need to. They all told me what I was. Kael and Rohan exchanged a look. It was a swift, silent communication that spoke of a lifetime of shared thoughts, a language built on twin bond and battle-honed instinct. It was a language she didn't speak, and its impenetrable secrecy felt like a wall being erected right in front of her, reminding her she was an outsider, a variable in their private equation. Convenient, Rohan remarked, his voice dry as sun-bleached bone. A spark of anger, hot and bright, flickered to life amidst the cold terror in her chest. It was a welcome heat. What is that supposed to mean? It means, Kael said, pushing off the mantle and closing the distance between them with a predator's fluid grace, that a dead alpha, especially a powerful one with rivals, is a very useful thing for certain people. And a conveniently, superstitiously cursed Omega, a rare and misunderstood creature, makes for the perfect, blameless scapegoat. No one questions a curse. They just fear it. The idea was so foreign, so monstrous in its political coldness, that it stole the air from her lungs. She had lived with the weight of her guilt for so long, had worn her supposed curse like a shroud of thorns, each point a reminder of the life she had inadvertently taken. The possibility that it was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated murder pinned on the most vulnerable person in the room, was almost more terrifying than the curse itself. If she wasn't cursed, then what was she? Just a pawn? A disposable victim? The thought was somehow more degrading. And if she wasn't cursed, then the terrifying magnetic pull she felt toward these two lethal males, this deep, instinctual hum of rightness that vibrated in her very marrow, was real. And that was a danger far greater than any magical ailment. A curse could be endured. This This feeling promised a surrender she wasn't sure she could survive. No, she shook her head, the intricate white braids whipping against her cold cheeks. You're trying to confuse me. To twist my memories. To make me let my guard down so you can. She trailed off, unable to voice the conclusion. So we can what, little prissy? Kael murmured, his voice a low, intimate thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very stones beneath their feet. He was close enough now that his body heat was a brand against her chilled skin, his scent, wilderness, cold night air and pure, untamed power, wrapping around her, a heady mix that her traitorous wolf craved with a desperate ache. If we wanted to force a bond, we could have tried in the woods. If we wanted you dead, we would have left you to the elements. Our blood is quiet for the first time in decades. The static that has been our constant companion since we came of age. It's gone. That isn't confusion. That's a fact. He reached out, slower this time, his movements deliberate, giving her every opportunity to flinch away, to scream, to fight. His fingers didn't go for her face. They moved instead to the back of her hand where it rested, clenched into a white-knuckled fist on the table. The contact was like a spark on dry tinder. A jolt of pure, undiluted energy shot up her arm, a current of warmth and profound rightness that made her gasp aloud. It wasn't painful. It wasn't the searing, wrong-feeling magic of her attempted bond with Alistair, which had felt like a cage slamming shut. This was deep, primal. It felt like a lock clicking open in a door she didn't even know existed within her soul. Her wolf didn't just stir. It surged forward, pressing against the inside of her skin with a desperate, joyous whimper, its presence so strong she almost heard the sound in the room. Yes, the home. She snatched her hand back as if burned, cradling it against her chest as if wounded. Her heart was hammering, a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. Panic, cold and sharp as an ice shard, sliced through the confusing, seductive warmth. Don't, she breathed, the word laced with a terror that was entirely new. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of belief. Kael's eyes glowed with a fierce, possessive light. He had felt it too. She could see it in the triumphant, almost savage set of his jaw, in the way his stormy gaze darkened with a new, profound intensity. You can lie to yourself, Prissy, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for her alone, a secret shared in the firelit dark. You can cling to that story of death because it's simpler than the truth. But your wolf doesn't lie. And neither do we. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling and utterly, completely disarmed. Because the greatest threat was no longer the curse she carried. It was the devastating, terrifying, and utterly unwelcome hope that she didn't carry one at all. And that meant the only thing left to fear was the terrifying pull of the two predators who claimed she was their salvation. The silence after Kael's retreat was a living entity, thick and pulsating with everything left unsaid. Priscilla stood frozen, the phantom sensation of his touch still burning on her hand. It was a brand, but one that felt less like ownership and more like a key turning in a lock she'd sworn to keep sealed forever. Her wolf, that treacherous inner beast, was pacing restlessly, a low, continuous whine echoing in the confines of her mind. Safe. Ours. Home. She wanted to scream at it, to beat the feeling back into submission. They are not safe. We are not home. This is a gilded cage, and the bars are their scent, their presence, their lies. Rohan had moved to the large wooden sink, his back to her as he began to clean the bowl she had used. The mundane domesticity of the action was surreal, a stark contrast to the seismic revelation that had just shattered her reality. He worked with an economical efficiency, his silver-eyed focus on the task as if scrubbing away the remnants of her meal was the most important thing in the world. It was a performance of normalcy designed to unnerve her, and it was working. You don't believe me, she said, her voice sounding small and lost in the vast high-ceilinged room. It wasn't a question. Rohan didn't turn around. It's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of evidence. He rinsed the bowl, setting it on a rack to dry with a soft clink. Our condition is documented. By our healers, by our elders. The chaos in our blood is a fact of our existence, as real as the scars we carry. He finally turned, leaning back against the counter and crossing his arms, his gaze sweeping over her from her tangled white braids to her trembling hands. The stillness we feel in your presence is a new data point, one we cannot ignore. A data point? A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. I'm a person, not one of your Your experiments. Aren't you experimenting on yourself? He countered, his voice still infuriatingly calm. Testing the limits of your starvation? The depth of your isolation? You've been running a trial on your own survival, and the results from what we found in that clearing were not promising. His words were like a physical blow, stripping her bare of the last vestiges of her pride. He was right. She had been conducting a grim experiment, and the conclusion had been foregone. A slow, cold, lonely end in the shattered lands. These twins, with their terrifying intensity and their impossible claims, were a variable she had never accounted for. So what now? She whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. The warmth from the fire suddenly felt oppressive, smothering. You keep me here? Like a pet? A living, breathing medicine for your condition. We keep you safe. A voice rumbled from the shadows near a doorway she hadn't noticed. Kael emerged, having shed his shirt. The firelight played over the sculpted planes of his chest and abdomen, over the taut muscles of his arms and the dark trail of hair that disappeared into the waistband of his pants. He was a vision of raw, primal power, and her mouth went dry. He held a thick woolen blanket in his hands. And you sleep. You're dead on your feet. He tossed the blanket onto the larger of the two chairs by the fire. You can have the chair. It's more comfortable than the cot in the other room, and the fire will last the night. Priscilla stared at the offered blanket, then at the chair. It was a concession, a small kindness that felt more dangerous than any threat. It was easier to fight against aggression. This subtle care, this show of provision was disarming. It made her want to trust them, and that was the most perilous path of all. I'm not tired, she lied, her body betraying her with a jaw-cracking yawn the moment the words left her mouth. Kael's lips twitched. Of course not. He walked to the hearth and dropped to the floor, leaning his back against the stonework with a sigh that spoke of his own weariness. To her astonishment, Rohan moved to the other side of the hearth and did the same, mirroring his brother's posture. They were bracketing the fire and by extension her. What are you doing? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Sleeping, Rohan said simply, closing his eyes. The floor is familiar. We've spent many nights on it. They were staying. They weren't going to leave her alone in this room. They were going to be right here, their powerful bodies flanking her, their scent enveloping her, their presence a constant, watchful pressure. It was a protective gesture, but it felt like a siege. Her prison had just become infinitely smaller. Hesitantly, she moved to the chair and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. It was thick and surprisingly soft, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the clean, wild scent that was uniquely theirs. She sank into the worn leather, the exhaustion of the last few days, of the last few years, crashing down on her all at once. Her eyelids felt like lead weights. She fought it, forcing her eyes to stay open, watching the two brothers in the flickering light. Kael's head was tilted back against the stone, his eyes closed, the scar through his brow stark in the shadow. He looked younger in sleep, the relentless intensity banked to a simmer. Rohan was just as still, his breathing even, but she had the uncanny feeling he was still aware of everything, that even in rest he was calculating, guarding. The warmth of the fire, the fullness in her belly, the sheer physical safety of the fortified room, it was a potent narcotic. Against her will, her eyes fluttered shut. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just to rest her eyes. She drifted in a hazy, half-aware state, the boundary between dream and memory blurring. She was back in the ceremonial circle, the cold stones under her bare feet, Alistair's greedy eyes upon her. The bonding magic surged, a painful, invasive force, and she braced for the familiar horror, the guilt, the crushing weight of his death. But this time it was different. The magic didn't feel wrong. It felt like coming home. It felt like the touch of Kael's hand on hers. It felt like the deep, resonant silence of Rohan's gaze. It felt like warmth and strength and a rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. A sound tore through the dream, sharp and real, yanking her back to consciousness. It was a howl. Long, low, and piercingly lonely, it cut through the deep silence of the night outside the fortress walls. It was not the sound of a common wolf. It was a shifter's cry, filled with a complex language of warning and possession. Priscilla's eyes snapped open. Her heart leaped into her throat, pounding a frantic rhythm of pure, undiluted panic. They found me. My old pack. He's come. Across the fire, Kael and Rohan were already on their feet, their bodies coiled and tense, Their sleepiness vanished in an instant. They were fully alert, their heads cocked, listening. The peaceful tableau of moments before had shattered. Another howl answered the first, this one closer. Much closer. It was a different voice, deeper, more aggressive. A threat. Kael's gaze, dark and deadly serious, locked with hers across the room. The storm in his eyes had returned, full of fury and a protective ferocity that stole her breath. Ours, he growled, the word a low, possessive snarl that was both a promise and a declaration of war. The world outside, the world she had run from, had just arrived on their doorstep. And the fragile, terrifying hope she had begun to feel was about to be tested by fire and fong. The howl hung in the air, a vibrating threat that seeped through the stone walls and settled like frost in Priscilla's bones. Every muscle in her body locked, a deer sensing the wolf pack closing in. Here, Alistair's pack. They've come to take me back, to finish what they started. The stew she'd eaten turned to a cold, hard stone in her stomach. Kael and Rohan moved as one, a synchronized dance of lethal grace. There was no panic, no frantic shouting. Only a chilling, efficient purpose. Rohan crossed the room in 3 long strides, snuffing out the single oil lamp that burned on the table, plunging the great room into a world of shifting, predatory shadows cast by the dying fire. The sudden darkness was a physical blow, amplifying the sounds of their movement and the terrifying silence that followed the howls. Kael was at the main door, not touching it, but standing to the side of the heavy iron-banded wood, his head tilted, listening. His bare chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm, the firelight glinting off the tense cords of his neck. He was a statue of contained violence. How many? Rohan's voice was a bare whisper from the window, where he had peeled back a corner of the heavy hide covering just enough to peer into the moonlit night. 2 that I consent. Maybe more downwind. Kael's answer was a low rumble. Not our pack. Strangers. Strangers. The word should have been a relief, but it wasn't. If it wasn't her old pack, then who? Rogues? A rival clan drawn by the rumor of a moon-cursed Omega? The possibilities were all terrible. Priscilla found herself standing, the blanket pooled at her feet. She didn't remember rising. Her body was trembling, a fine, constant vibration of pure animal fear. She was trapped. Caged with 2 dangerous alphas with more circling outside. There was no escape. The walls of the fortress, which had felt like a prison moments before, now felt terrifyingly thin. They're circling, Rohan reported, his voice still calm but with an undercurrent of steel. Testing the perimeter. They know we're in here. Let them test, Kael growled, his gaze cutting through the gloom to find her. His eyes glowed with a faint, feral light. They won't like what they find. A new sound came then. Not a howl, but the soft, deliberate crunch of a footstep on the gravel path outside the main door. It was followed by a low, guttural voice. We know you're in there. We don't want to fight. Just send out the Omega. Priscilla's breath hitched, a sharp, painful sound in the tense silence. They're here for me. Of course they are. She was the poison, the trouble. She drew death and violence wherever she went. She took a step back, her shoulders pressing against the cold stone of the fireplace. There was nowhere else to go. Kael's response was not with words but with a sound. A low, deep growl emanated from his chest, a vibration so primal it seemed to shake the very air in the room. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated warning. A sound that said mine. The silence from outside was profound. Then a different voice, higher, more nasal, spoke. She's not worth it, brothers. She's the cursed one. The one who killed Alpha Alistair. Hand her over and you avoid a war you can't win. Hearing her crimes spoken aloud, her shame given voice by a stranger in the dark, was a fresh wave of humiliation. She wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she could disappear into the stone. It was Rohan who spoke this time, his voice cutting through the dark like a shard of ice. You are on our land. You are threatening what is ours. The only war here is the one you started. And you will lose it. What is ours? The phrase was becoming a mantra, a chain winding around her, binding her to them whether she wanted it or not. But in this moment, surrounded by enemies in the dark, the chain felt less like a restraint and more like the only solid thing in a collapsing world. A snarl came from outside, followed by the sound of a heavy body shifting. Last chance. Kael finally moved from the door. He crossed the room to a weapons rack she hadn't noticed in the far shadows. He didn't grab one of the polished axes or the wicked bow. His fingers closed around the hilt of a long, brutal-looking hunting knife. The metal whispered as he drew it from its sheath. The sound was a promise of blood. He didn't look at her as he walked back to his post by the door. But he spoke, his voice a low, clear command that brooked no argument. "Priscilla. Get down. Behind the chair. Do not move. Do not make a sound." The use of her full name, the absolute authority in his tone, severed the last of her frayed nerves. She dropped to her knees behind the large leather chair, pulling the wool blanket over her head like a child hiding from a storm. The world narrowed to the scent of leather and wool, the frantic thudding of her own heart and the agonizing weight. The silence from outside stretched, taut as a bowstring. She could feel the tension radiating from Kael and Rohan, a coiled spring readiness that charged the air. She heard the soft, almost imperceptible sound of Rohan shifting his weight by the window, likely palming a weapon of his own. Then a different sound. A sharp, splintering crack from the side of the house, followed by the shattering of glass. They weren't at the door. They were trying the window. A roar of fury erupted from Rohan's side of the room, a sound of pure, territorial rage. It was answered by a triumphant snarl from outside. This was it. The siege was breaking. The door was about to be rushed. They were coming in. Huddled in the dark, buried under the blanket that smelled of her captors. Her protectors. Priscilla did the only thing she could. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed to a moon that had never listened to her before. But this time her prayer was not for escape. It was a desperate, terrified plea that the two monstrous, beautiful, impossible men standing between her and the darkness would be as powerful as they claimed. The world exploded. The splintering of wood and the shriek of tearing iron hinges drowned out Priscilla's gasp. The main door, a slab of oak and metal she would have thought impregnable, burst inward, torn from its moorings by a single terrifyingly powerful blow. Moonlight and the scent of pine and aggression flooded the room. Two massive, shifted wolves filled the doorway, their fur bristling, fangs bared and gleaming with saliva. They were brutes, all raw muscle and fury, their eyes burning with the mindless hunger of rogues or hired thugs. Time seemed to warp, slowing to a nightmarish crawl. Kael moved. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He was a force of nature in human form. As the first wolf lunged through the ruined doorway, Kael met it not with retreat, but with a devastating forward thrust. The long hunting knife in his hand became an extension of his will. He sidestepped the snapping jaws with a fluidity that defied his size, his body twisting, and drove the blade deep into the beast's shoulder, right at the juncture of muscle and bone. A deafening, pained yelp shattered the air, more shock than agony. The wolf stumbled, its charge broken. But the second was already on him. Priscilla watched, frozen behind the chair, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. The second wolf was bigger, its aim true. It went straight for Kael's throat. A shadow detached itself from the window. Rohan. He didn't roar. He didn't snarl. His silence was more terrifying than his brother's fury. He moved like a phantom, closing the distance in a heartbeat. As the wolf leaped, Rohan's arms snaked around its neck from the side, using the beast's own momentum against it. There was a brutal, efficient wrench, a sickening crack of vertebrae that was louder than the fight itself. The wolf went limp in his grasp, a puppet with its strings cut. He dropped the lifeless body to the floor, his silver eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, already scanning for the next threat. The first wolf, wounded and enraged, scrambled back to its feet, ignoring the blood streaming from its shoulder. Its focus was entirely on Kael, who stood panting slightly, his knife dripping onto the stone floor. The beast gathered itself for another lunge. Never got the chance. From the shattered window, a third wolf launched itself into the room, a blur of gray fur and malice, aiming for Rohan's exposed back. Rohan! The scream was torn from Priscilla's throat before she could stop it. Kael's head snapped towards his brother at her cry. He saw the threat a fraction of a second too late to intervene. Rohan, however, had already pivoted. He didn't try to dodge. He dropped low, becoming a smaller target, and as the wolf sailed over him, he drove his fist, clad in what looked like hardened leather knuckle dusters, straight up into its ribcage. The sound was a wet, percussive crunch. The wolf let out a choked whine and crashed into the table, splintering it. The room was a cacophony of snarls, the coppery stench of blood and the raw, panting breaths of the fighters. The first wounded wolf, seeing its packmates fallen, let out a low growl of uncertainty, its eyes darting between the two brothers who now stood back to back, a united front of devastating power. Kael's chest was heaving, his knuckles white on the hilt of his knife. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his cheek. Rohan's posture was still deceptively relaxed, but his hands were held in loose fists, ready to break and kill again. Their power was not just in their strength but in their synchronicity. They fought as a single entity, each knowing the other's movements, covering blind spots, a perfectly lethal dance. The wounded wolf took a step back, then another. The fight had gone out of it. With a final, defiant snarl, it turned and fled back through the ruined doorway, melting into the night. Silence descended, heavier and more profound than before. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of Priscilla's breathing. Kael and Rohan didn't move for a long moment, their senses stretched out into the darkness, ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then slowly they turned. Their eyes, stormy gray and piercing silver, found her where she cowered behind the chair. She was shaking uncontrollably, her pale blue eyes wide with a terror she could no longer contain. She had seen death before, but she had never seen it delivered with such brutal, efficient grace. Kael took a step towards her, his body still thrumming with the aftermath of violence. Blood smeared his chest and hands. He was a vision of primal, terrifying beauty. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her trembling form, ensuring she was unharmed. In the depths of his stormy eyes, the fury banked, replaced by something hotter, more possessive. Rohan moved to the ruined door, shoving the heavy wood back into the broken frame as a temporary barricade. The cold night air still seeped in, carrying with it the scent of blood and victory. The siege was over. They had won. But as Priscilla looked from the dead wolf on her left to the one groaning by the shattered table, she understood the cost. The world knew where she was now. And this was only the beginning. Kael finally broke the silence, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through her. "See, little Prissy?" he said, his bloodied lips curling into a ghost of a smile. "We keep what's ours." And for the first time, staring at the carnage they had wrought to protect her, she felt the cold, hard truth of those words settle deep in her soul. She was theirs. And the terrifying part was, in the raw, bloody aftermath of their defense, a part of her no longer wanted to run. Silence. Not the tense, waiting silence from before, but a thick, heavy quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wet, ragged breathing of the dying wolf by the table. The coppery stench of blood was a metallic fog in the air, coating the back of Priscilla's throat. She remained on her knees behind the chair, her body locked in a paralysis of shock. The wool blanket was a suffocating shroud, but she couldn't make her fingers release their death grip on the fabric. She had just watched two men dismantle three massive wolves with their bare hands and a single knife. It hadn't been a brawl. It had been a brutal, clinical demonstration of power. A symphony of breaking bones and tearing flesh. Kael was the first to move. He walked to the wolf he'd stabbed, the one now trying to drag its useless front leg as it whined and snarled by the door. There was no hesitation, no ceremony. He placed a boot on its neck and, with a single brutal thrust, ended its suffering. The whining stopped. The finality of the act was a cold splash of reality. Priscilla flinched, a small, involuntary sound escaping her lips. Kael's head snapped up, his stormy gaze finding her. He dropped the bloodied knife with a clatter onto the stone floor and crossed the room towards her. He moved with a predator's grace, even now, even covered in the evidence of the fight. He didn't stop until he was towering over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low rasp. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, traveled up the length of him, the blood-smeared chest, the corded forearms, the cut on his cheek still welling crimson. She finally met his gaze. The storm there had not abated. It had merely changed, the lightning replaced by a dark, possessive intensity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, the words clipped. She shook her head, a tiny, jerky motion. No, she wasn't physically hurt. She was something else. Something broken and remade in the space of a few violent minutes. His eyes scanned her anyway, a quick, assessing glance that missed nothing. Seemingly satisfied, his attention shifted to the room. We can't stay here. The scent will draw more than just curious wolves. From across the room, Rohan was already pulling a large waxed canvas pack from a storage chest. 5 minutes, he stated, his voice calm as if they were preparing for a routine trip, not fleeing a blood-soaked stronghold. He began stuffing it with supplies from the cupboard with an unhurried efficiency that was somehow more frightening than Kael's raw fury. Kael nodded, then his gaze returned to her. Can you stand? The question was simple, but it felt like a test. She wasn't sure she could. Her legs felt like water, her entire being numb. But the thought of him touching her, of those blood-stained hands hauling her to her feet, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system. She nodded again, using the chair to pull herself up. Her legs held barely. She stood there, swaying slightly as the twins moved around her. They were a whirlwind of purpose, ignoring the corpses on their floor. Rohan tossed a smaller pack to Kael, who caught it one-handed and began filling it with what was left of the food and a water skin. Priscilla just watched, a ghost in her own nightmare. This was her fault. The shattered door, the dead shifters, the forced flight. It was all because of her. The curse wasn't just in her touch. It was in her very presence. She was a plague. They called me the cursed one, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. They knew what I was. What I did. Kael straightened up, slinging the pack over his shoulder. He walked over to her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the wild electric scent of him beneath the iron tang of blood. He cupped her chin, his grip firm but not painful, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and fierce, his eyes burning into hers. They were sent by someone. They knew your name, your history. That wasn't a random attack. That was a retrieval. His thumb stroked once, a rough, startling caress over her jaw. Your curse is a story, Prissy. A story someone is very invested in keeping alive. But stories can be rewritten. He released her and turned to help Rohan secure the barricade more firmly. Priscilla stood rooted to the spot, his words echoing in her mind. A story. Could it be true? The doubt, a tiny, fragile seed, began to unfurl in the dark soil of her fear. Rohan finished and turned, his cool silver eyes taking in the room one last time before landing on her. He held out a bundle of dark, heavy fabric. A cloak. Put this on. The night is cold and we have far to go. The gesture, so practical and yet so considerate, undid her. After the violence, after the blood and the declarations, this simple act of provision was what finally broke through the numbness. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but not before Rohan saw it. His expression didn't change, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if her tear was an expected data point in his calculations. She took the cloak, her fingers fumbling with the thick clasp. It was too big for her, the hem pooling at her feet, the shoulders swallowing her slight frame. It smelled of pine and frost, of them. It felt like another kind of cage, but this one, for the first time, felt like it might also be a shelter. Kael moved to the ruined door, peering out into the moonlit night. Clear, he murmured. Rohan gestured for her to go ahead of him. Stay between us. Do exactly as we say. No questions. Priscilla pulled the hood of the cloak up, the world narrowing to the slice of night visible through the torn doorway. She took a shuddering breath, the air cold and clean in her lungs, washing away the stench of blood. She was leaving the first semblance of shelter she'd had in weeks, walking back into the unknown, flanked by the two most dangerous creatures she had ever known. But as she stepped over the threshold, past Kael's protective, bloodied form, a strange certainty settled over her. The running was over. The war had begun. And she was no longer just the prize. He was the reason. The cold was a living beast, biting through the heavy cloak with needle-sharp teeth. Each breath Priscilla took was a cloud of frost that hung in the air before her face, a fleeting ghost in the moonlight. They moved in a tight, silent formation, Kael a dark, fluid shadow in the lead, Rohan a solid, watchful presence at her back. They didn't speak, their communication reduced to the occasional flick of a hand signal or a low, guttural sound that was more animal than human. They were leading her away from the fortress, not on a path, but into the very heart of the wild. The skeletal trees of the shattered lands reached for them with claw-like branches, their footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of frozen moss and decaying leaves. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the violent cacophony they had left behind. It was a silence that felt watchful. Priscilla's mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel of fear and doubt. A story. He said it was just a story. But the memory of Alistair's body hitting the stone was not a story. It was a scar on her soul. Yet the way Kael and Rohan had fought, the way their presence quieted something in her, even now as terror chilled her blood, it whispered of a different truth. A more complicated one. Kael stopped so abruptly she almost walked into his back. He raised a closed fist. Rohan went still behind her, his hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder, a silent command to halt. The contact, even through the layers of wool, was electric. It wasn't a caress. It was a brand of ownership, a signal of control. Mine to protect. Mine to command. Her wolf, the ever-traitorous creature, preened under the touch. Kael's head was tilted, his body taut as a bowstring. He was listening, scenting the wind. After a long, tense moment, he pointed to their left, towards a dense thicket of brambles and a fallen log that formed a natural, shadowy alcove. Rohan's hand on her shoulder tightened, steering her firmly towards it. "In," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. They crowded into the small space, the brambles snagging at their clothes. It was a tight fit. Priscilla was pressed between the fallen log and Kael's broad back, with Rohan's chest a solid wall against her spine. She was surrounded, engulfed by their heat, their scent, their overwhelming presence. The primal masculine smell of them, pine, cold night, and the faint, wild musk of wolf, was inescapable. It should have been suffocating. So why did a part of her feel anchored? Before she could untangle the thought, she heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps, careful and deliberate, approaching from the direction they had just come. Not the reckless charge of the attackers, but the stealthy, patient tread of hunters. Her breath hitched. Rohan's arm slid around her waist from behind, pulling her flush against him, his other hand coming up to cover her mouth. It wasn't rough, but it was absolute. A silent order. Not a sound. She could feel the hard planes of his body, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back. Kael, in front of her, had gone preternaturally still, his head cocked, every sense focused on the approaching threat. She was trapped between them, a secret held in the jaws of two predators. The footsteps came closer. She could hear the soft rustle of clothing, the faint jingle of a buckle. 2 men, maybe 3. They paused, not 20 feet from their hiding spot. "The trail goes cold here," a low voice grumbled. "The blood stops. They're covering their tracks. The twins are clever." This voice was higher, more nasal. The same one from outside the fortress. "The Omega is slowing them down. We'll pick up the scent again at first light. The Alpha will not be pleased. The Alpha will have his prize. The cursed one can't run forever. And when we find her, the twins will be dealt with. No one steals from our pack." The words were a cold fist closing around her heart. So was her old pack. They hadn't given up. They had sent a second, more skilled team. And they would kill Kael and Rohan for the crime of protecting her. The men lingered for a few more agonizing seconds, their presence a palpable pressure in the night. Then, with a final muttered curse, their footsteps began to recede, fading back into the silent forest. No one moved. Rohan's hand remained over her mouth, his arm a steel band around her waist. Kael didn't relax his vigilant stance. They waited, listening long after the sounds had faded, ensuring it wasn't a trick. In the absolute stillness, pressed between their powerful bodies, Priscilla became hyper-aware of every sensation. The rough bark of the log against her cheek. The solid warmth of Kael's back. The way Rohan's breath stirred the hairs at her temple. Her own heart, which had been hammering with fear, began to slow, sinking with the calm, steady rhythm of the heart beating against her spine. It was in that quiet, suspended moment that she felt it. A low, deep thrum, like the purr of a massive cat, vibrating through Kael's body and into hers. It was a sound of pure, primal satisfaction. A hunter content in his lair, with his prey exactly where he wanted it. The sound shouldn't have been comforting. It should have been the most terrifying thing of all. But as Rohan finally, slowly lowered his hand from her mouth, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second on her lips, she realized the most terrifying truth of the night. The fear of being caught by her old pack was a cold, familiar dread. But the fear of wanting to stay right here, trapped in the dark between these two monstrous, beautiful men, was a hot, shameful, and terrifyingly new kind of terror. The hunter's footsteps faded into a memory, swallowed by the immense, waiting silence of the forest. Still the twins did not move. Priscilla remained pinned between them, the heat of their bodies a stark contrast to the biting cold of the night. The pressure of Rohan's arm around her waist, the solid wall of Kael's back against her front. It was a cage of flesh and bone, and with every passing second her frantic heartbeat began to slow, lulled into a false sense of security by the very danger that contained her. Finally, Kael let out a slow, controlled breath. The deep, thrumming purr she'd felt through his back ceased. He shifted just enough to glance over his shoulder, his stormy eyes scanning her face in the deep shadows. They're gone. For now. Rohan's arm loosened its hold, but he didn't pull away entirely. His hand slid from her waist to rest on the small of her back, a possessive, grounding weight. They'll backtrack at dawn. We need to be deep in the high crags by then. He stepped back, breaking the intimate contact, and the cold night air rushed in to claim the space his body had occupied. Priscilla shuddered, feeling the loss of his heat like a physical wound. The reaction shamed her. She wrapped the oversized cloak tighter around herself, trying to trap the lingering scent of them, the ghost of their warmth. Kael turned fully to face her. In the faint moonlight filtering through the brambles, he was a sculpture of shadow and sharp angles. The cut on his cheek had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, treacherous line down his face. "You held your silence," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Good." The praise, delivered in that rough, matter-of-fact tone, sent an unwelcome flicker of warmth through her chest. She hated that it mattered. Hated that a simple acknowledgement from this brutal alpha could make her feel anything other than fear. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice raw. "You always have a choice, little Prissy," Kael countered, his lips curving into that faint, dangerous smile. "You could have screamed. You could have tried to run to them. You didn't." He leaned in closer, his scent enveloping her. "Your wolf knows where it belongs." Before she could form a rebuttal, Rohan spoke from the edge of their thicket, his gaze fixed on the treacherous path ahead. "We move. Now." They set off again, the pace more urgent now. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinner and colder. Priscilla's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest. She stumbled over an unseen root, her knees buckling. She braced for the impact with the frozen ground. It never came. Kael's arm shot out, catching her around the waist and hauling her upright against his side as if she weighed nothing. "I've got you," he grunted, his grip firm and unyielding. She wanted to shove him away, to reclaim the tattered shreds of her independence. But her body, treacherous and exhausted, sagged against him, drawing strength from his solidity. He didn't release her after she found her feet. He simply adjusted his hold, his arm remaining a band of steel around her, half carrying, half dragging her up the steep incline. It was no longer just about speed, it was about preservation. Her mind reeled. One moment they were ruthless killers, dispatching threats with brutal efficiency. The next they were, this, a steadying arm in the dark. A shared cloak. A quiet praise. The dichotomy was maddening. It was like being warmed by a fire that could at any moment decide to consume you. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a narrow ledge, shielded from below by a rocky outcrop. A shallow cave, little more than a scar in the mountain's face, promised a few hours of respite. "Here," Rohan said, his voice the first sound in what felt like hours. "We rest until the moon sets." Kael finally released her, and she stumbled the few steps to the cave wall, sliding down it onto the cold stone. She was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her hollowed out and frozen to the core. She watched as Rohan shrugged off his pack, pulling out a water skin and a strip of dried meat. He handed them to her first. Again that simple, devastating act of provision. Kael stood at the edge of the ledge, a sentinel against the night, his broad back to her. The wind tugged at his dark hair. He was the storm, wild and untamable. Rohan was the deep, still mountain, ancient and unyielding. And she was caught between them, a fragile ember they were determined to keep from being extinguished. As she took a small, hesitant bite of the tough meat, the reality of her situation settled over her, heavier than the cloak. She was dependent on them for her next breath, her next step, her very survival. The freedom she had fought so hard for was gone, replaced by a terrifying new bondage. But as she looked from Kael's protective silhouette to Rohan's calm, assessing gaze, a shocking realization dawned. This bondage for the first time didn't feel like a cage. Felt like a claim. And the most terrifying part of all was the tiny, glowing ember in the ashes of her soul that whispered it might just feel like a home. The cave was a tomb of cold silence, the wind outside a mournful dirge. Priscilla sat with her back against the unyielding rock, the borrowed cloak a futile shield against the deep, seeping chill of the mountain. Her body was a tapestry of exhaustion, each thread pulled taut to the point of snapping. Yet, sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of a knife, the lifeless slump of a wolf, the possessive fire in Kael's gaze. The twins were a study in contrasts even at rest. Kael remained at the mouth of the cave, a statue hewn from shadow and defiance. He didn't pace or fidget. His stillness was that of a predator conserving energy, every sense stretched out into the night, a living alarm system. Rohan had settled a few feet inside, his back against the opposite wall, his long legs stretched out before him. His eyes were closed, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. His awareness was a tangible thing, a low hum in the confined space that mirrored the vibration she'd felt from Kael in the thicket. She was the fragile, breakable thing between them. The prize. The burden. The silence stretched, becoming a third, oppressive presence. It was in this quiet that the doubts, her constant companions, began to whisper again. They're using you. You're a tool to quiet their blood, a means to an end. The moment you're no longer useful or the moment you become too much trouble, they'll discard you. Just like everyone else. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her forehead on them. The coarse fabric of the trousers Rohan had given her scratched her skin. Everything here was rough, hard, and real. There was no softness, no pretense. It was a world of stone and sky and the brutal truth of tooth and claw. And she was the only soft thing in it. Your thoughts are loud enough to wake the dead. Rohan's voice, quiet and composed, cut through her spiraling fears. She flinched, lifting her head to find his silver eyes open and fixed on her. He hadn't moved. I'm not thinking anything, she lied, her voice a hoarse croak. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It wasn't a kind expression. It was the smile of a mathematician who has just found an error in a complex equation. Lying doesn't suit you, Priscilla. You lack the practice. The use of her full name, spoken in that cool, analytical tone, felt more intimate than Kael's growled little Prissy. It was a recognition of the person she was beneath, the fear, the survivor, the thinker. It was unnerving. Why are you doing this? The question burst from her, fueled by a confusion that was rapidly eclipsing her fear. You could have left me in the woods. You could have handed me over to those men and avoided all of this. She gestured vaguely at the cave, the mountain, the entire desperate situation. We told you why, Kael answered from the entrance without turning around. His voice was a low rumble blending with the wind. You quiet the storm. That's not an answer, she insisted, a spark of her old defiance igniting. That's a sensation. A feeling. It's not a reason to risk your lives, to be exiled from your pack, to become hunted. Now Kael turned. The moonlight carved out the sharp planes of his face, his eyes glowing like banked coals. What is a better reason then? Land? Power? The approval of a pack that would see us chained to a destiny of madness. He took a step toward her, his presence suddenly filling the small cave. You think our lives before were something worth preserving? The constant war inside us, the knowing looks, the pity? We were living ghosts in our own skin, Prissy. He stopped, his jaw working as if searching for the right words. You feel like life. Real, unvarnished life. That is a reason. The only reason that matters. His words hung in the air, raw and shocking in their honesty. They weren't the polished words of a courting alpha. They were the confession of a feral creature that had just found water after a long drought. Rohan spoke again, his voice a calm counterpoint to his brother's intensity. You operate on the assumption that you are a burden. You are re-evaluating the data of your own worth based on flawed parameters, the opinions of a pack that used you as a scapegoat. He tilted his head, his gaze dissecting her. Our parameters are different. Our evidence is the silence where there was once chaos. Our conclusion is that you are essential. The word was a key, turning another lock deep inside her. It wasn't about being wanted or desired or even loved. It was about being necessary. To them. To their very existence. She looked from one to the other. Kael all fierce, untamed passion. Rohan all cool, unshakable logic. Two sides of the same lethal coin. And they were both looking at her as if she were the center of their universe. The ember of hope in her chest, the one she had tried so hard to smother, burst into a small, steady flame. It was terrifying. It was dangerous. But for the first time since she'd fled her old life, it didn't feel like a lie. She didn't have an answer for them. There were no words adequate for the seismic shift happening within her. So she simply bowed her head, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they had laid bare. The howl of the wind was the only sound for a long moment. Then Kael turned back to his vigil and Rohan closed his eyes once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer oppressive. It was a pact, spoken in the ancient language of stone and sky, sealed in the quiet space between three hearts beating in the dark. The running was over. The war was coming. But in that cold, high cave, Priscilla finally stopped fighting the one thing that could save her. She stopped fighting them. Dawn was a pale, reluctant smear of gray against the bruised canvas of the sky. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness so profound Priscilla could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She had dozed fitfully, her head pillowed on her arms, jerking awake at every imagined sound. Each time she'd found one of the twins watching her, Kael with a dark, unwavering intensity from the cave mouth, Rohan with a calm, analytical gaze from across the small space. Their vigilance was a constant, unnerving comfort. Now, as the weak light filtered into the cave, Kael turned from his post. His movements were fluid, a predator stretching after a long night's hunt. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, found her immediately. "Up," he commanded, the single word brooking no argument. "We have a few hours before they pick up our trail. We use them." Priscilla pushed herself stiffly to her feet, her body protesting every movement. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, and exhaustion was a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Use them for what? Rohan was already repacking their meager supplies with his customary efficiency. "For your first lesson," he said, not looking at her. "You cannot be a liability. A liability gets people killed. Specifically, us." The bluntness of his statement was like a splash of ice water. It stripped away the fragile sense of connection she'd felt in the night, reducing her back to a problem to be solved. A variable in their survival equation. Her chin lifted, a spark of defiance igniting in her pale blue eyes. "I've survived on my own just fine." Kael let out a short, derisive laugh. "Surviving on rabbits and fear isn't living. It's a slow suicide." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. "Your wolf is a cowering thing beaten down by lies. It's time it remembered what it is." Her breath hitched. "What it is? It's a curse. Just like me." "No." The word was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from his chest into hers. "Your wolf is power. It's instinct. It's the part of you that knows how to fight, how to hunt, how to take what it needs." His gaze dropped to her lips for a fleeting electric second before returning to her eyes. "And it wants us. It recognizes its alphas. You're just too stubborn to listen." Before she could form a retort, his hands shot out, gripping her upper arms. His hold wasn't cruel, but it was immovable, like being held in place by bands of forged steel. A startled yelp escaped her. "What are you doing?" "Teaching you the first lesson." Kael's voice was a rough whisper, his face inches from hers. His scent, wild and storm-charged, filled her senses, making her head spin. Submission. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Submission. The very word was a trigger, a nightmare of forced bonds and stolen choices. Her wolf, which had been curiously quiet, immediately recoiled, whimpering in the dark corners of her mind. "Oh, not again. Never again. Let go of me," she snarled, trying to wrench herself free. It was like trying to move a mountain. His grip didn't tighten, but it didn't yield an inch. "This isn't about bending your neck to our will, little prissy," Kael murmured, his eyes holding hers captive. "This is about you choosing to trust your own instincts. Your wolf knows we are its safe harbor. Your mind is the only thing fighting it. So stop fighting." Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. He hated this. Hated the feeling of being physically overpowered. Hated the way her body was reacting to his proximity, not with revulsion but with a traitorous, humming awareness. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block him out, to find the numb place she'd lived in for so long. "Look at me." It was Rohan who spoke this time. He had moved to stand beside his brother, a silent, formidable pillar. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Priscilla's eyes fluttered open. She looked from Kael's fierce, demanding gaze to Rohan's cool, expectant one. They were a united front. There was no escape. "Your fear is a weapon you wield against yourself," Rohan stated, his silver eyes dissecting her terror. "It keeps you weak. It keeps you prey. We are offering you a different path." "I don't want your path," she cried out, her voice breaking. "But your wolf does," Kael countered, his voice dropping, becoming almost hypnotic. "Feel it, Prissy. Stop thinking. Just feel." He gave her a small, deliberate shake, not to hurt her, but to jolt her out of her spiraling thoughts. In that moment of physical disruption, her mental barriers slipped. And for a single, heart-stopping second, she let herself feel. She felt the raw, untamed power in Kael's hands, a power that could break her but was inexplicably holding her together. She felt the steady, unwavering certainty in Rohan's presence, an anchor in her raging sea of fear. And beneath her own panic, she felt her wolf. It wasn't cowering. It was pressing forward, tentatively, yearningly, towards the strength they offered. It saw not a threat but a shelter. Not a cage but a territory it desperately wanted to belong to. A shuddering sob escaped her. The fight drained out of her, leaving her boneless and trembling in his grasp. She didn't go limp in defeat. It was a different kind of surrender. A conscious, terrifying decision to lower her shield. She stopped pulling against his hold. Her head bowed, not in shame but in acceptance. Her breathing, which had been ragged, began to slow, matching the steady rhythm of his. Kael's grip eased, his thumbs stroking once, slowly, over the fabric of her sleeves. A rumble of approval vibrated in his chest. "There," he breathed, the word thick with satisfaction. "That's it." He released her and stepped back. Priscilla stood on trembling legs, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt raw, exposed, as if a layer of skin had been stripped away. She had not submitted to their will. She had submitted to a truth her own soul had been screaming at her. They were her alphas. And the terrifying, liberating truth was that a part of her was fiercely, profoundly glad of it. The first lesson was over. And as she stood there in the cold light of dawn, she knew with a chilling certainty that it had only been the beginning. The world had shifted on its axis. The cave, the cold, the towering presence of the twins. It was all the same, yet nothing was. Priscilla stood with her arms wrapped tightly around her middle, the ghost of Kael's grip still burning on her skin. It wasn't a mark of pain, but of possession, and the most terrifying part was the part of her that thrummed in response, a silent, resonant yes. Kael watched her, his stormy eyes holding a new, speculative light. The raw intensity had banked, replaced by a simmering satisfaction that was somehow more potent. He had won a victory, but not over her. He had won her surrender to herself. "The hunters will be moving," Rohan stated, his voice cutting through the charged silence. He shouldered his pack, his movements as efficient and unreadable as ever. "We need to be gone." Priscilla nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion. She couldn't find her voice. The defiance she had clung to for so long felt like a discarded shell, leaving her soft and vulnerable beneath. She moved to follow Rohan as he headed out of the cave, but Kael's voice stopped her. "Not that way." She turned. He was gesturing not down the mountain toward the relative safety of the deeper valleys, but up toward the jagged, snow-dusted peaks that clawed at the sky. "Up." The word was a disbelieving croak. "There's nothing up there. No cover. No game. It's a death sentence. It's the last place they'll look for a lone Omega," Rohan said, pausing at the cave mouth. "They will assume we are taking the easiest, most logical path to shelter. They will expect cunning, not madness." "It is madness," she insisted, a flicker of her old self sparking. Kael's lips curved into that faint, dangerous smile. "Then it's a good thing you're not alone anymore." He walked toward her, not with a threat, but with a purpose that made her heart stutter. "We're not asking." The choice, it seemed, had been made for her. But this time the resentment was a pale, weak thing, smothered by the chilling logic of their plan and the unsettling trust that was beginning to take root in the cracked soil of her soul. They set off, the ascent brutal and unforgiving. The air grew thinner, each breath a sharp, burning ache in her chest. The rocky path was treacherous, littered with loose scree that shifted underfoot. Kael led the way, his pace relentless, his body a study in powerful, efficient motion. Rohan brought up the rear, a silent, watchful shadow. Priscilla focused on placing one foot in front of the other, on the burning in her muscles, on anything but the terrifying new reality unfolding inside her. But her mind kept circling back to the cave, to the feeling of yielding, to the look in Kael's eyes. After an hour of grueling climb, they reached a narrow, windswept ledge that offered a dizzying view of the forest below, a vast sea of green and gray. Kael called a halt, gesturing for them to take cover behind a cluster of large, weather-beaten boulders. As she slumped against the cold stone, gasping for air, Rohan moved to the edge, his gaze sweeping the terrain below like a hawk. After a long moment he went perfectly still. There, he said, his voice low. Priscilla's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her knees, peering cautiously around the boulder. Far below, tiny as insects from this height, she could see them. 4 shifted wolves, moving in a loose formation along the very path they would have taken had they gone down. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Rohan was right. They had anticipated a logical escape. They had never considered this suicidal climb. "They're following our old scent," Kael murmured, coming to stand behind her. He was so close she could feel the heat of him through her cloak. "They have no idea we're watching them from the roof of the world." A strange, fierce pride bloomed in her chest. They had outsmarted them. She had outsmarted them by being with these 2 madmen. But as she watched, the lead wolf below suddenly stopped. It lifted its head, scenting the air. It turned, and even from this impossible distance she could feel its focus shift. It wasn't looking along the path anymore. It was looking up, toward the lower slopes, toward a different, fainter trail. "They found the decoy," Rohan said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "I laid a false trail down the eastern ridge before first light. It will lead them on a chase that will cost them half a day." The strategic brilliance of it, the cold, calculated foresight, left her speechless. They weren't just brute force. They were tacticians. Every move was a piece on a chessboard she hadn't even known they were playing. The lead wolf below let out a sharp, excited bark, and the pack changed direction, flowing like a gray river toward Rohan's decoy. They were being led away. She was safe. For now. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her shoulders slumping in relief. The tension that had coiled in her belly since the howl in the night began to slowly unspool. It was then that a new scent caught on the wind, subtle but unmistakable. It was the same frost-kissed pine and wild storm scent of the twins, but different. Fainter. Carried from a great distance. Kael and Rohan both stiffened, their heads snapping toward the north. Their expressions, for the first time since she'd met them, shifted into something unreadable and dark. A silent communication passed between them, swift and heavy. "What is it?" Priscilla asked, her newfound sense of security evaporating. "What's wrong?" Kael's jaw was a hard line. "Our pack," he said, the words clipped. "The main encampment is on the move. They're closer than they should be." Rohan's silver eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw the final chilling piece of the puzzle fall into place. "They're not just hunting us, Priscilla," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They're hunting you. And it seems our pack has decided to join the chase." The word pack should have been a comfort. It should have conjured images of safety, of community, of a hearth fire shared among kin. But the way Rohan said it, cold, flat, and final, made it sound like a death sentence. The fragile sense of victory she'd felt moments before shattered, leaving her hollow and exposed on the high, windy ledge. Priscilla stared at him, the cold mountain air suddenly feeling like a physical pressure, crushing the breath from her lungs. Your own pack is hunting you? Because of me." Kael let out a sharp, humorless laugh. It was a bitter, raw sound. "They're not hunting us, little Prissy. Not directly. They're enforcing pack law. We took an unmated Omega without the Alpha's consent. We defied a direct order to return. In their eyes, that makes us rogues. and rogues who possess a claimed Omega are to be neutralized. His stormy gaze pinned her to the spot. The Omega is to be returned to her rightful Alpha. Rightful Alpha. The words were a brand, searing away the brief, foolish hope that had begun to kindle within her. There was no escape. There was only a different set of chains waiting to snap shut. Her old pack from one side, the twins' pack from the other. She was the bone between two starving dogs. "So that's it then," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She sank down onto the cold stone, the fight draining out of her completely. "There's nowhere to go. You're exiled because of me. Hunted because of me." She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small. "You should have left me in the woods." A low growl rumbled in Kael's chest. He crossed the ledge in 2 swift strides, crouching in front of her. His hands gripped her shoulders, not to shake her but to force her to look at him. His eyes were blazing. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a guttural snarl. "Do you see a man who regrets his choice? Do you see fear?" She looked. She saw the cut on his cheek, the wildness in his eyes, the absolute, unshakable certainty in the set of his jaw. He saw no fear. Only a furious, possessive determination. "They are rules written by old men in safe lodges," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "They don't apply to us. They don't apply to this." He gave her a slight shake, his gaze boring into her soul. "You are not a piece of property to be returned. Or ours." The declaration should have felt like a cage. Instead, it felt like a fortress wall slamming down around her, deflecting the world and its cruel, unjust laws. A sob caught in her throat, part despair, part a terrifying, exhilarating relief. From behind Kael, Rohan spoke, his voice cutting through the emotional tempest with its usual chilling clarity. "The strategic situation has changed, but the objective remains the same." He was looking north, his profile sharp against the pale sky. "Their presence complicates our route, but it does not make our path impossible. It merely requires recalibration." He turned his head, his silver eyes meeting hers over Kael's shoulder. "The question, Priscilla, is not whether we can evade them. The question is whether you believe you are worth the war we are about to wage on your behalf." The question hung in the thin, cold air, the most important one she had ever been asked. It wasn't about her curse. It wasn't about her past. It was about her future. Was she worth it? Was the scared, broken Omega, the convenient scapegoat, worth the exile and the blood of these 2 formidable men? Her wolf, the part of her that was finally finding its voice, answered without hesitation. It pushed against her skin, not with fear but with a low, steady thrum of power. It felt strong. It felt worthy. Kael was still watching her, his grip on her shoulders unwavering, his gaze demanding an answer. She took a shuddering breath, the cold air filling her lungs, clearing the last of the panic from her mind. The ember of hope was no longer a tiny spark. It was a flame fed by their defiance, by their unwavering claim. "I don't know if I'm worth it," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But I know I don't want to go back. And I know," she hesitated, the words feeling too big, too dangerous to speak aloud. "I know I don't want to be anywhere but with you." It was as close to a surrender as she could give. A choice. Her choice. Kael's intense expression softened, just a fraction. A slow, real smile touched his lips, transforming his fierce face into something devastatingly handsome. "That's all we needed to hear, little Prissy." He released her shoulders and stood, offering her his hand. It was a gesture of partnership, not possession. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face and finally at Rohan, who gave a single curt nod of approval. She placed her hand in Kael's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and impossibly strong. "Good," Rohan said, turning his gaze back to the north, his mind already mapping their new, more dangerous course. "Then let's go start a war." Kael's hand was a brand around hers, a tether to a reality that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He didn't release her as they began to move, pulling her along the narrow, windswept ledge with a confidence that brooked no argument. The path was even more treacherous now, a dizzying ribbon of rock that skirted a sheer drop into a mist-shrouded abyss. Priscilla kept her eyes fixed on his broad back, using him as a focal point, her trust in his strength a fragile but growing thing. Rohan moved ahead of them, scouting the way with a predator's silent grace. The air was so thin it burned, and every gasped breath was a small victory. The world had been reduced to this. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the whip of the wind, the solid warmth of Kael's hand in hers, and the looming threat that now came from every direction. Her mind, however, was a churning sea. Our pack has decided to join the chase. The words echoed, each repetition a hammer blow to her newfound resolve. She had brought this upon them. The twins, these powerful, untamable forces of nature, were now outcasts because they had chosen to protect a stranger, a woman marked by a curse everyone believed in. Was it a lie? The question was a splinter in her soul, working its way deeper. Kael and Rohan acted with such absolute certainty. They fought for her as if she were a treasure, not a plague. The memory of Alistair's death was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but the edges were beginning to feel less sharp, less definitive. Could a political murder truly be disguised as a mystical curse? The thought was as vertigo-inducing as the drop beside her. Kael suddenly stopped, his grip on her hand tightening. He pulled her flush against the rock face, his body shielding hers. Up ahead, Rohan had frozen, one hand raised in a silent signal. Priscilla held her breath, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear nothing but the wind. What had they sensed? Her old pack. There's some new unknown danger? They came. Faint at first, then swelling in volume. A long, mournful howl that seemed to ripple through the very mountain itself. It was not the aggressive cry of the hunters from the night before. This was different. It was a call filled with a complex, aching language of summons and sorrow. It was a sound that spoke of home and hearth, of loyalty and loss. It was the voice of the twins' pack. The sound tore through her, a physical ache. This was the community they had lost. Because of her. Kael's body, pressed against hers, was rigid. She could feel the tension coiling in him, a spring wound too tight. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his jaw a hard line of granite. This was the cost. This was the price of his claim. She could feel the echo of that howl in the taut muscles of his back, in the faint tremor that ran through the hand holding hers. Rohan remained motionless, his head tilted, listening. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cool assessment, but she saw the way his fingers curled into a fist at his side. He was not unmoved. The bond of a pack was not easily severed even for them. The howl faded, its mournful note hanging in the thin air before being snatched away by the wind. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound, filled with the ghosts of the life they had left behind. Priscilla couldn't bear it. The weight of their sacrifice was crushing her. "You should go," she whispered, her voice breaking. She tried to pull her hand from Kael's, but his grip was iron. "Answer the call. Go back to them. I'll find a way. You don't have to do this." Kael finally turned his head. The storm in his eyes was not one of anger, but of a fierce, blazing conviction that stole the air from her lungs. "That call is for ghosts," he said, his voice a low, raw rasp. "The men who belonged to that pack are dead. They died the moment we found you." His thumb stroked over her knuckles, a rough, possessive caress. "This," he squeezed her hand, "is the only pack that matters now." His words were a vow, sealed not in a ceremonial circle, but on a desolate mountain ledge with the echo of their old life fading around them. He was choosing her not just over safety or comfort but over his very identity. The immensity of it was staggering. Rohan turned then, his silver gaze sweeping over them. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his agreement silent but absolute. The howl had been a test and they had passed. Their loyalty was no longer to a name or a territory or a set of laws. It was to her. The last of her resistance crumbled, not into despair, but into a profound, humbling acceptance. She was theirs, and they were hers. It was a bond forged not in tradition but in defiance. It was a pact written in blood and sealed in exile. Kael gave her hand a final, firm squeeze before releasing it. "We keep moving," he said, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone, but with a new underlying current of something that sounded like peace. "The high pass is just ahead. It's the only way through now." Priscilla nodded, her pale blue eyes clear for the first time since they had fled the fortress. The fear was still there, a cold companion, but it was no longer in control. She had made her choice. They had made theirs. As she fell into step behind Kael once more, The echo of the pack's howl was no longer a sound of loss. It was the sound of a door closing, of a past being left behind. And ahead, through the biting wind and the treacherous path, lay a future that was terrifying, uncertain, and utterly, completely theirs. The high pass was a wound in the mountain, a narrow, scree-strewn gully scoured by a wind that held the bite of true winter. They moved through it single file, the world reduced to the back of the person in front and the relentless, grinding effort of the climb. Priscilla's lungs were ragged strips of fire, her legs leaden and trembling. The thin air made her light-headed, and the world would occasionally tilt on its axis, the vast empty drop to her right yawning like a hungry mouth. Kael set a brutal pace, his powerful form eating up the ground, but he would pause every so often, a silent, solid anchor in the swirling mist, waiting for her to close the gap. He never offered help, never reached out a hand. The lesson from the cave had been learned. This was a different test. It was a test of endurance, of her will to keep up, to prove she was not the liability Rohan had named her. Rohan was a ghost behind her, his presence felt more than seen or heard. He was the rear guard, the ever-watchful sentinel, but his silence now felt different. It was no longer just analytical. It was heavy with the memory of the pack's howl, a weight she knew she shared. They emerged from the gully onto a broad, flat expanse of wind-polished stone, a natural altar at the top of the world. The view was staggering, a panoramic tapestry of jagged peaks and deep, shadowed valleys, all painted in shades of gray and purple by the fading afternoon light. The world lay at their feet, vast and indifferent. For a moment, the sheer scale of it stole the breath Priscilla had fought so hard to keep. Kael stopped at the center of the stone platform, his boots scraping against the rock. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the impossible vista before settling on her. His chest rose and fell in deep, even breaths, his expression unreadable. "We rest here," he announced, his voice carrying easily in the thin, clear air. "This is the only crossing for miles. If they're coming, they'll come through here." The statement was a cold dash of reality. This wasn't a scenic overlook. It was a potential killing ground. The sense of awe evaporated, replaced by a familiar, chilling dread. Rohan moved past her, his silver eyes scanning the edges of the plateau, assessing sightlines and potential cover with a soldier's precision. "We have the high ground, but we are exposed." He glanced at the sky, where the sun was beginning its final descent. "We have 2 hours of light. Maybe less." Priscilla sank onto a low, flat rock, her body screaming in protest. She pulled the cloak tighter, but it was a futile gesture against the deep, penetrating cold of the high altitude. She watched the twins, these two halves of a single formidable will, preparing for a battle that might never come, or that might come with the dying of the light. Kael walked to the northern edge of the plateau, the direction from which their own pack would come. He stood there for a long time, a solitary silhouette against the immense sky, his shoulders set in a hard line. He was not just keeping watch. He was waiting. He was challenging them. The wind whipped her white braids across her face, stinging her cheeks. She was so tired. Tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Tired of the gnawing guilt that came with every glance at their resolute backs. "What happens if they come?" she asked, her voice small against the vastness. Rohan, who was checking the edge of a long, wicked-looking dagger, didn't look up. "Then we fight. And if you lose?" This time he did look up. His silver eyes were cold and clear like the mountain lakes far below. "Then we die. And you are taken back to a life you have already rejected." He sheathed the dagger with a definitive click. It is not an acceptable outcome. The blunt finality of his words should have terrified her. Instead, they ignited a spark of something else. Something harder. She thought of the cold, judging eyes of her old pack. The possessive, dead weight of Alistair's gaze. The feeling of being a thing to be owned, a problem to be solved. That was not a life. It was a slower, colder death than any this mountain could offer. She looked at Kael's broad, unyielding back. She remembered the feel of his hand around hers, the possessive rumble in his chest, the way he had looked at her in the cave and on the ledge. "You are the only pack that matters now." He had carved out a piece of this harsh, unforgiving world and claimed it for them. For her. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs protesting but her resolve firm. She walked to the edge of the plateau, not to the north where Kael stood, but to the east, looking back the way they had come. The forest where her hunters lurked was a dark, brooding sea. Somewhere down there was the cage she had escaped. She felt Kael's gaze on her. She turned to face him. The wind tore at her clothes, whipping the cloak around her like a banner. Her pale blue eyes, usually wide with fear, were now clear and steady. "I won't go back," she said, her voice not loud but carrying a new iron core. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. A vow. "I don't care who comes. I won't let them take me." Kael's intense stare held hers across the stone altar. The setting sun painted his face in hues of gold and orange, catching the flecks of silver in his stormy eyes. A slow, fierce smile spread across his face, a predator's smile of pure, unadulterated approval. "That's my girl," he murmured, the words a caress carried on the wind. In that moment, on the altar of stone at the top of the world, surrounded by the threat of two packs, Priscilla was no longer just running. She was no longer just surviving. She was choosing her ground. And she was ready to defend it. The sun bled out across the peaks, staining the snow caps in hues of fire and rose before surrendering to the encroaching purple twilight. The wind, a constant, keening presence, grew sharper, laden with the promise of a killing frost. On the stone altar of the high pass, the temperature plummeted. Priscilla stood her ground, the cold seeping through the soles of her boots and climbing her spine. Kael's approval was a tangible warmth in her chest, a shield against the physical chill. He had moved from the edge, joining her and Rohan in the center of the plateau, a strategic triangle of readiness. They didn't speak. Words were useless now. The only language that mattered was the one of tooth and claw, of muscle and will. Rohan handed her a small, heavy object. It was a knife. Not the long hunting knife Kael favored, but a shorter, sturdier blade, its hilt worn smooth from use. Its weight was both foreign and comforting in her hand. "You will not be a liability," he said, his voice low. "The business end faces your enemy. Don't hesitate." She curled her fingers around the hilt, the cold metal warming to her touch. It was a tool, a promise, a share of their power. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. As the last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the world into deep blue shadow, the first wolf appeared. It was a gray, grizzled male, its fur thick and scarred, emerging from the northern pass with the quiet authority of a seasoned warrior. It was not the twins' alpha, but it was clearly a high-ranking enforcer. Its eyes, intelligent and cold, scanned the plateau, taking in their position, their readiness. It did not snarl or posture. It simply stood, a silent declaration of intent. Then another appeared beside it. And another. Until 5 wolves stood in a loose line, blocking the only exit to the north. The twins' pack. They had come. Priscilla's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. Her knuckles were white on the knife's hilt. This was it. The war they had promised. Kael took a single step forward, placing himself slightly ahead of her and Rohan. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. His dominance was a force that radiated from him in waves, pressing against the silent wolves. "Theron," Kael greeted, his voice a low, challenging rumble. "You've come a long way for a disappointment." The lead wolf, Theron, shifted. The process was swift, bones cracking, fur receding to reveal a man of similar age to the twins, with a grim, weathered face and eyes that held no mercy. He was clothed in simple, durable leathers. "This ends now, Kael." Theron's voice was gravelly, devoid of emotion. "You and Rohan will stand down. You will surrender the Omega. You will return to face the Alpha's judgment." Judgment for what? Kael's laugh was sharp and bitter. For choosing to live. For refusing to be shackled to a slow descent into madness. "Our crime is seeking a cure our own healers said didn't exist." He gestured to Priscilla without looking back. "Well, she exists." Theron's cold gaze flicked to her, and Priscilla felt it like a physical blow, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "The moon cursed? You've thrown away your birthright for a fairy tale and a poisoned whore." The insult landed, hot and sharp, but before the shame could take root, a growl tore from Kael's throat, so deep and feral it seemed to shake the very stone beneath their feet. It was a sound of pure, undiluted rage. "You will not speak of her," Kael snarled, taking another step, his body coiling. "She is worth more than your entire bloodline. She is ours." The finality in his voice was absolute. It was a line drawn in the stone. Theron's expression hardened. He knew there would be no negotiation. His hand moved in a subtle signal. The 4 wolves behind him fanned out, beginning their slow, deliberate advance. Priscilla. Rohan's voice was calm, a steady anchor in the rising storm. Stay behind us. If any get past, you use that knife. You do not freeze. She nodded, her breath coming in short, sharp pants. The world narrowed to the advancing wolves, to the solid forms of Kael and Rohan in front of her. This was it. No more running. Just as the tension was about to snap, a new sound cut through the thin air. A different howl. Higher, more desperate, and coming from the southern pass, the way they had come. Everyone froze. Priscilla's blood ran cold. She knew that sound. It was the hunting cry of her old pack. Theron and his enforcers halted, their heads turning towards the new sound, confusion and suspicion warring on their faces. From the southern gully, 3 wolves emerged. They were smaller, leaner, built for speed over raw power. And at their head was a wolf she knew all too well, Lysander, Alistair's most loyal lieutenant. His eyes, a hateful yellow, locked onto her with a venomous triumph. The plateau was no longer a battleground between the twins and their pack. It had become a 3-way standoff. The twins, their own pack, and the hunters from her past. She was the prize they all sought, trapped in the middle as the last of the light died, leaving them all in the cold, merciless dark. The world stopped. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. On the stone altar, under a canopy of emerging stars, 3 factions stood frozen in a lethal triangle. The air, already thin and cold, became thick with a new, more dangerous tension. The scent of confusion, calculation, and fresh, predatory interest. Priscilla's heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. Lysander. His name was a curse in her mind. He had been there the night Alistair died. He had been the first to scream, moon-cursed. His yellow eyes, gleaming with fanatical zeal, were a direct line back to her deepest trauma. The twins' pack, led by the grim Theron, had shifted their focus entirely. The internal dispute was momentarily forgotten. A rival pack trespassing so deep into their territory was a more immediate, more traditional threat. The 5 enforcers turned as one, their low growls forming a discordant chorus aimed at the newcomers. Kael and Rohan didn't move. They stood back to back now, a fortress of 2 with Priscilla shielded between them. Kael's attention was split between Theron and Lysander, his body thrumming with a volatile energy, ready to explode in any direction. Rohan's silver eyes were narrowed, his mind clearly racing, recalculating the odds in this new impossible equation. Lysander shifted. The process was quicker, more fluid than Theron's, revealing a man with a gaunt, fervent face. His gaze swept over the twins' pack with disdain before landing hungrily on Priscilla. "The runaway bride," he called out, his voice slicing through the growls. "Your alpha sends his regards. He is most eager for your return." His lips peeled back from his teeth in a mockery of a smile. "He has promised a vigorous reunion." Bile rose in Priscilla's throat. The knife in her hand felt suddenly pathetic, a child's toy against the nightmare he represented. "You are on forbidden ground," Theron's voice boomed, reclaiming his authority. He took a step toward Lysander, his enforcers mirroring him. "This is a matter for our pack. You will leave. Now." Lysander's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound. "Your pack. Seems your pack is in disarray. We are here for what is rightfully ours. The Omega belongs to Alpha Gideon. Her curse is our burden to bear, our sin to atone for." His yellow eyes flicked to Kael and Rohan. "Step aside and we will be on our way. You can return to whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at the standoff. "She belongs to no one." Kael's voice was a low, deadly whisper, yet it carried across the stone with chilling clarity. "She is her own. And she stays with us." The declaration hung in the air, a challenge to both groups. Lysander's feigned amusement vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You protect a murderess? A creature who kills her own kind?" "A story," Rohan countered, his voice like chipped ice. "Told by those who benefit from the lie. We are not interested in your fairy tales." The accusation, so calmly delivered, seemed to stagger Lysander for a second. His fervent certainty wavered, replaced by a flicker of something uglier, fear. The fear of a lie being exposed. Theron watched the exchange, his weathered face a mask of conflicting loyalties. The law was clear. The Omega was an outsider, a disruption. But these southern wolves were intruders, their claim aggressive and insulting. And his own alphas, the twin heirs he had helped raise, were standing against them all for this one fragile female. The standoff stretched, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Priscilla could feel it, the pressure building in the silence. Her fear was a living thing coiling in her gut. But beneath it something else was rising. Bigger. A pure, hot fury at being discussed like property, at being hunted like an animal, at the lies that had stolen her life. She looked at Lysander, at the man who represented everything she had fled. She saw not a righteous hunter but a fanatic clinging to a falsehood. She looked at Theron, who saw her only as a problem to be solved. And then she looked at the two broad backs shielding her. They saw her. Not a curse, not a prize, but a person. A partner. The spark came from an unexpected place. The curse is a lie. Priscilla's voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the tension like her little knife. Every eye on the plateau turned to her. She took a small step out from the protection of the twins, her pale blue eyes fixed on Lysander. Alistair didn't die because of a curse. He was murdered. And you helped. Lysander's face went slack with shock, then contorted with rage. You lying little. It's the only thing that makes sense, she pressed, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a truth she was only now beginning to fully believe. Why would you hunt me so relentlessly? Not for justice. For silence. You're afraid I'll figure it out. You're afraid someone will believe me. She turned her gaze to Theron and his enforcers. They aren't here for justice. They're here to tie up a loose end. And you, she looked back at the twins, her voice softening, you are the only ones who see the truth. The silence that followed was deeper than before, charged with a new volatile energy. Theron was looking at Lysander with dawning suspicion. Lysander was vibrating with pure, exposed hatred. The fragile alliance between the two hunting packs had shattered. Kael's lips curved into a slow, savage smile. He looked from Theron to Lysander, his stormy eyes alight with a feral joy. Well, he said, cracking his knuckles, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. It seems we have a common enemy after all. The powder keg exploded. Kael's words were the spark that lit the fuse. For a single suspended heartbeat, the world was a diorama of frozen snarls and wide, calculating eyes. Then Theron, his loyalty to the pack's territory overriding the internal conflict, gave a sharp, guttural command. Drive out the trespassers. The 5 enforcer wolves surged forward, not towards the twins but toward Lysander and his 2 hunters. The plateau erupted into chaos. It was not a clean battle of 2 sides but a savage 3-way melee. Lysander's hunters, cornered and desperate, fought with the frantic energy of rats. Theron's enforcers were disciplined and powerful, a wall of muscle and fong. And in the center of it all, Kael and Rohan became a whirlwind of focused, brutal efficiency. Their objective was not to win the battle for their pack. It was to break through the chaos and escape. With me. Kael roared, his voice cutting through the snarls and yelps of pain. He didn't shift. He became something else entirely, a force of nature in human form. He moved toward the fray, not away from it, plowing into the space between a grappling enforcer and one of Lysander's hunters. He grabbed the hunter by the scruff of its neck and, with a terrifying display of raw strength, hurled the shifted wolf bodily into 2 of Theron's enforcers, sending them all tumbling in a yelping heap. Rohan was his shadow, his movements a study in precise, economical violence. As an enforcer lunged at Kael's exposed flank, Rohan intercepted it, his forearm slamming into the wolf's throat. He didn't try to kill it, just to incapacitate. A sharp, precise blow to the snout with the hilt of his dagger sent the beast reeling back, whimpering and disoriented. They were creating a path. A bloody, chaotic corridor through the warring factions. Priscilla now. Rohan barked, his calm voice a razor through the bedlam. Her feet were rooted to the stone. The scene was a nightmare of flashing teeth, spraying saliva, and the sickening thuds of bodies colliding. The coppery stench of blood filled the air. Her knuckles were white around the knife, her entire body trembling. Then a wolf, one of Lysander's, its eyes mad with panic, broke from the main fight and charged straight for her, seeing her as the weak link, the easy way out. Time slowed. She saw its gaping maw, the yellowed fangs, the intent to kill in its eyes. Her mind screamed, a wordless cry of terror. Her wolf, the one Kael was trying to awaken, cowered. But her hand, the one holding Rohan's knife, moved. It was not a skilled thrust. It was a desperate, panicked lunge. She threw her weight forward, the blade extended, turning her body away as she did. The wolf yelped, a high-pitched sound of surprise and pain. The knife, wielded by her clumsy, terrified strength, didn't strike a killing blow. It sliced a deep gash along the beast's shoulder. It was enough. The charge faltered. The wolf stumbled, its attack broken. The shock of the impact reverberated up her arm. She had done it. She had drawn blood. She had fought back. A massive hand closed around her upper arm. He pulled her forward, his grip bruising, his eyes blazing with a feral pride. "That's my girl," he growled, shoving her behind him as he turned to block a swipe from Theron himself, who had broken through to confront them. "This is madness, Kael." Theron snarled, trading a blow with him. "It's freedom." Kael shot back, driving a fist into Theron's midsection, making the older man grunt. Rohan was there then, a silent wraith. He didn't engage Theron. He simply grabbed Priscilla's other arm and pulled. "The path is open. Go." He shoved her toward the northern edge of the plateau, where Kael's initial charge had created a temporary gap. Behind her, she heard Kael deliver a final, shoving blow to Theron, sending the enforcer stumbling back into the fray. She ran. She didn't look back. Her lungs burned, her legs pumped, the knife still clutched in her slick, bloody hand. The sounds of the battle began to fade, replaced by the roar of blood in her ears and the frantic gasps of her own breath. She reached the edge of the stone altar and skidded to a halt. There was no path. Only a steep, scree-covered slope that vanished into darkness. Strong hands grabbed her from behind. He didn't pause. He lifted her, throwing her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," he grunted. And then he jumped. Not into the abyss, but onto the steep slope, half running, half sliding down the unstable shale. Rohan was right beside him, a stabilizing force, grabbing onto stunted trees to control their descent. Priscilla squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in Kael's back, the world a terrifying, jolting blur of motion and noise. The sounds of the battle on the plateau above were swallowed by the night, replaced by the rushing wind and the clatter of dislodged stones. They had done it. They had broken through. They had escaped the trap. But as Kael finally slowed his headlong flight, setting her back on her feet on more stable ground, the reality of their situation crashed down upon her. They were deeper in enemy territory than ever, with two packs now having a vested interest in their capture or death. She looked up at Kael, his chest heaving, his face smeared with dirt and someone else's blood. He looked down at her, his stormy eyes wild and alive. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a spatter of blood from her cheek. "You fought," he said, his voice rough with pride and exertion. Priscilla looked at the bloody knife still in her hand, then back at him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was no longer the only thing there. A slow, grim smile touched her lips. "I did," she whispered. The spark of the fighter within her had been lit. And in the darkness of the descending night, it burned with a defiant, promising flame. The silence of the deep woods was a physical presence, thick and absolute after the cacophony of the plateau. They stood in a small, dark hollow, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of Priscilla's heart. The scent of blood and pine was a sharp, metallic tang in the cold air. Kael set her down, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment, ensuring she was steady on her feet before releasing her. His chest rose and fell in deep, controlled gulps, his stormy eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness around them, every sense stretched to its limit. He was a bowstring still vibrating from the release. Rohan melted out of the shadows beside them, his arrival silent as a ghost. A dark stain bloomed on the sleeve of his shirt, but his expression was as composed as ever, his silver eyes assessing their surroundings with a chilling calm. "They will not follow tonight," Rohan stated, his voice low. "The conflict on the plateau will occupy both groups. We have a few hours." Priscilla simply nodded, her own breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She could still feel the jarring impact of the knife in her hand, the shocking give of flesh and muscle. She looked down at her palm. It was sticky, smeared with dark, drying blood that was not her own. The knife, Rohan's knife, was still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She had to consciously will her fingers to uncurl, letting the blade clatter softly onto the bed of pine needles at her feet. The sound seemed to snap the last of her composure. A violent tremor racked her body, starting deep in her core and radiating outwards until her teeth chattered. It wasn't just the cold. It was the aftershock. The adrenaline that had fueled her desperate lunge was gone, leaving her hollow and shaking. She had fought. She had drawn blood. She was no longer just the prey. A low, approving rumble came from Kael's chest. He stepped closer, his large, warm hands coming up to cradle her trembling arms. His touch was not possessive or demanding this time. It was steadying. Solid. "Look at me, little prissy," he murmured, his voice a soft, gravelly command. She lifted her gaze, her pale blue eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears in the faint starlight. She expected to see triumph, the fierce gloating of a victor. But his expression was different. Softer. The storm in his eyes had quieted to a deep, intense warmth. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his thumbs stroking slow, soothing circles on her sleeves. "The power. It's always been in you. They just buried it under lies and fear." A single hot tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime and blood on her cheek. He gave a shaky, jerky nod. He did feel it. A new, raw energy humming just beneath her skin. Her wolf, for the first time, wasn't cowering or yearning. It was present. Awake. It had liked the fight. "I killed him," she whispered, the words a confession torn from a place of deep old shame. "Alistair. I felt the bond snap. I felt him die." Kael's gaze didn't waver. "Did you?" he asked, his voice still gentle. "Or did you feel a lie being severed? A false connection, poisoned from the start, finally breaking?" The question hung between them, reframing her entire reality for the second time that night. She had carried the weight of his death like a millstone. What if she had only ever carried the weight of a lie? From the shadows, Rohan spoke. "The body betrays the mind under poison. A spasm, a seizure, a failed heart. It could mimic the rupture of a true bond to those who wanted to see it." He moved closer, his analytical gaze sweeping over her as if she were a fascinating new discovery. "You did not kill him, Priscilla. You survived him." The finality in his tone, the cool, logical certainty, was the final brick removed from the wall around her heart. The guilt, the shame, the belief in her own monstrous nature. It didn't vanish, but it cracked, crumbling into dust and blowing away on the cold mountain wind. A sob broke from her, then another. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of release. Of a truth so liberating it was painful. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't a murderer. She was a survivor. She swayed on her feet, the emotional and physical exhaustion finally overwhelming her. Kael's arms slid from her arms to around her back, pulling her against his chest. She didn't resist. She collapsed into his solid strength, her face buried in the warm, blood-scented leather of his vest, her body shaking with the force of her crying. He held her. He didn't shush her or tell her to be strong. He just held her, one hand cupping the back of her head, his chin resting on her hair. His presence was an unbreakable shelter. When the sobs finally subsided, leaving her spent and boneless, she became aware of Rohan again. He had retrieved the fallen knife, cleaning the blade meticulously on a handful of moss before offering it back to her, hilt first. "A tool," he said quietly. "Not a crutch. You know how to use it now." She looked from the clean knife to his calm, serious face, then up at Kael, whose gaze held a fierce, protective pride. The last of the tremors stilled. She took the knife, her grip firm and sure this time, and slid it into the empty sheath on her belt. She was no longer just Priscilla, the runaway Omega. She was Priscilla who had stood her ground, who had drawn blood, who was wanted not for what she was but for who she was becoming. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold, clean air filling her lungs. It tasted different. It no longer tasted of fear. It tasted of freedom. And it tasted of them.